I'm often asked by students to describe some of my human rights and foreign policy career. There's a little more in the bio on that, but you're going to hear more today as well. So I thought I'd take the opportunity at this student-led event to share a little bit of my story, my career, and how I got into that, but also, more importantly, some lessons learned that can help, I think, all of us to remain hopeful in what seem like increasingly difficult times. And the key to that, in my opinion, is finding new and creative ways to collaborate and work together. So the first phase that I talk about, or that I want to share with you, is I titled it Poverty and Injustice. I graduated from Georgetown University wanting to change the world. And my biggest concern at that time was helping alleviate poverty. Some suggested I might want to volunteer and join the Peace Corps, but at the time, all I saw was the US government as a very bad actor around the world and really didn't want to have anything to do with the US government. Just remember that because it becomes a little ironic later in my story. So instead, I decided to volunteer for a Christian relief and development agency called Food for the Hungry in Thailand and Laos. There, I really didn't have a whole lot to offer, being a recent grad, but I did some administrative support and backup on projects related to small-scale irrigation, literacy, and agriculture. But most importantly, during the 3 years I spent in those two countries, was I learned the language and I learned some great cross-cultural skills. I was a learner for those first 3 years. I decided to go back to grad school to try to increase some of my skill set. And I went to Michigan State for my master's and transferred here to UW a little bit later to finish my PhD. As part of that, I returned to northern Thailand and did some research. There's a picture of my research team up there on rural poverty and rural livelihoods in northern Thailand. And that research concluded with a very human rights-based conclusion. I heard from the villagers that some of the main challenges they had were related to their land rights or lack thereof, and their lack of citizenship, both very human rights-related issues. So some of the principles I took from that phase of my career that are important for, I believe, important for collaborating effectively, was to prioritize local voices. Any project like Leslie's or others, you'll notice she consulted first with the people on the ground, and they need to be always in the lead. The second principle I learned was that while each context can be very complicated and complex, there are universal principles related to protecting human rights and human dignity and respect that bubble up. And when I went back to grad school, I also learned that some of those universal principles not only applied in rural Thailand, but also applied in rural communities here in Wisconsin and around the country. So as part of understanding that I would only have one piece of the puzzle when you're collaborating effectively, I wanted to study that piece. And I never really wanted to go back to graduate school, but a friend of mine came to Thailand to replace me in that office, and he had just done a PhD at Cornell on adult education. And I started to realize that I could actually study that community problem solving, and that got me really excited. So that's an important piece. And as you're thinking about where your niche is, because that is a key to positive collaboration and your own contribution, is to think about different levels of influence and change that you might have and that others might have. Expertise is really important to bring to bear on social issues and some of the things we study here at the university. But if local knowledge is not added to that expertise, you're gonna miss some of the impact that you could otherwise have. So what's key for all of us is to think about what is my role and what is my niche, and also thinking about levels of influence and change. Personally, I preferred working with communities and I'm a relational person, and I liked working at that level and knowing the people that I was impacting. But as it turns out, remember my dislike of the US government, it turns out that people, some villagers in poor situations, at least the ones I interacted with, actually wanted and kind of sought out some help from larger institutions, like our embassies around the world, like the UN, et cetera. So I started to think, I better check my own assumptions about what's important and what could affect change. So this next phase of my career, I like to call my speak truth to power phase. I left UW and I spent 10 years in Washington, D.C. and London, with some small stints in New York and Geneva, working for international organizations. I had a very steep learning curve going from rural community development to government work. But my primary role there was to hold other governments accountable for the human rights abuses they were perpetrating. So I was placed in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor first. I also spent a year on the National Security Council. And the approach really when you're in a government position like that is to name and shame other governments. So I participated in the annual human rights report drafting for the countries I covered in Asia, and also the Trafficking in Persons report issued annually by the State Department, and contributed to speeches and events for the President, the First Lady, and the Secretary of State. So this is can be a powerful platform, and I knew that. I worked very hard to try to get issues of human rights raised at high levels. But the key priority that I always focused on that kept me grounded was listening to dissidents and survivors themselves, listening to their stories and asking them, what can I do as a US official to help support your cause and raise your issues? So that prioritizing of local voices came to play there. One example of that I wanted to share is working with a friend of mine, Cham Tong here. She's won many human rights awards and is just an amazing woman. So back in the early 2000s, her organization, the Shan Women's Action Network, published a report called License to Rape. It documented over 600 cases of rape as a weapon of war, rape by the Burmese military against ethnic minority women. In this report, Shan women, but it happens to the Geran and the Chin and the Mon in Burma, now Myanmar. So this report was circulating a little bit in the State Department, but many people were able to say, oh, well, we don't know if that's really true. That's just a small women's organization on the border. So my boss at the time sent me to the border, to the Thai-Burma border, and it was this beautiful convergence of different pieces of myself. I was able to draw from that experience I've had before and use my language skills and my cultural skills, as well as my social science research skills that I learned in grad school, and listen to a group of 12 women who had just recently come across the border, and all of whom, from grandmas to preteens, had been raped by the military, and they were very traumatized. But it was one of the most powerful parts or events in my career, being able to listen to their stories, and then with Cham Tong's help, they were advocating using those stories at the UN, and I was advocating back in DC, having written a trip report about those women's stories. We got international press, and at the time were able to convince the then UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Burma he had been going inside the country to investigate human rights, but of course wasn't getting access to the areas where these rapes were occurring. So we were able to convince him to go to the border, listen to the women's stories directly, and I believe we had some influence working together. Some of the principles that I draw from that stage in my life about the importance of collaboration was first allowing freedom in practice. As a government official, it can be very helpful. You can be helpful to people who want your assistance to raise your case with other governments, et cetera, but it can also be risky, that sort of exposure. So it's just important, no matter what role you're in, to be honest about your limitations and honest about what you can and can't do. I think humility and intentionality in diversity are important principles for collaboration. You need to look around and understand who's not at the table and know the things you don't know. and know that you need other voices and you need to listen to other voices. You need to commit to integrity and transparency. Sometimes I think people think if you're working on human rights or anti-human trafficking, these are noble causes, and that gives you sort of free rein to achieve your goals any way you can. But in fact, means matter, process matters, and you need to protect and be respectful and treat even your opponents with human dignity, or with dignity and respect. And you need to learn to lose some battles and move on, because you will be able to fight another day. And to commit to diligence in learning. One of the things I like to say is that lazy advocacy is often worse than no advocacy at all. If you're advocating based on poor information, you can actually end up doing quite a bit of harm. And in human rights work, it's important, your reputation means everything. An ability to influence means you need to maintain your good reputation by having sound facts. And then to know that win-wins are possible. So win-wins often are difficult, but the key to finding a win-win situation is to look for common goals. And one example of that in the human rights space, I'll talk about this streets in just a second, is the debate over legalizing prostitution. You have two different groups. One group fighting human trafficking believes that prostitution should be legalized, because then it would be easier to regulate for coercion and trafficking. A whole other group believes it should be completely banned because it feeds human trafficking. Both are legitimate approaches to that particular challenge, but they often can't really work together very easily. But both those groups, one thing they have in common is they all believe that children should not be in brothels. So together, they can actually join forces and work very effectively to counter child trafficking and child prostitution, or child trafficking, because any child prostitution is human trafficking. And finally, I just wanted to share, I have the very, very great honor to be involved in a relatively new initiative here on campus. The overall initiative is called 4W, Women, Wellbeing in Wisconsin and the World. And it's just been such a joy to work with my fellow 4W supporters, with our donors, our partners, and my wonderful colleagues, one of whom is Leslie, you heard from, and you'll hear from some others later today. And it's been an incredible example of creative collaboration that has allowed all of us to apply some of the principles I discussed earlier to a very pressing challenge of human trafficking, both locally and globally. And it's allowed us also the freedom to incorporate survivor voices in ways that they're not usually included, and to incorporate art and all sorts of different things in the research to practice activities that we take on. And so just to conclude, human rights work is incredibly difficult, and frankly, it's getting harder. Some of the things that I did in my career would probably be impossible now. We've got some crumbling institutions, we've got divisive politics, and I'm even tempted to despair sometimes. But there is hope, and there's hope in groups like this, in innovation, in technology, in young people, young adults' understanding of the power of storytelling and multiculturalism. So there's hope, and that creates a space for infinite number of ways that we could all be creatively working together to confront injustice and stand against issues like human trafficking. So I'm looking forward to seeing how all you find new ways to creatively collaborate so that we can continue to hope together. Thank you.